introduce our speakers.
Sure, yeah. And hello, everyone. I'm Jules, the chair of panel 4. In this section, we have three speakers to discuss the BRI's impact on religions in Malaysia and the Philippines. And our speakers are Doce, Xiaokun, and Alvin Camba. Doce is a PhD candidate at the Indo-Pacific Research Center of Murdoch University, Australia, and his dissertation is about the political economy of halal regulation in the Philippines. The second speaker, Xiaokun, is a PhD candidate at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And his research focuses on the Chinese Salafi Muslim network that connects mainland China with Malaysia. And the third speaker, Alvin Camba, is an assistant professor at the Joseph Cobo School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's a faculty affiliate at the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy and the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And after presentation, Dr. Orlando Woos will lead the discussion on the research. Dr. Woos is an associate professor of geography and associate dean in the Institute for Urban Transformation in Asia at Singapore Management University. His research is interdisciplinary, spanning social, cultural, and political geography, urban studies, new media and communications, and critical infrastructure studies. And now, let's warmly welcome our first speaker, Doce.
Hello, good morning. I'm Doce from the Philippines. I know it's kind of early. I hope you won't get sleepy with my voice. So for today, I will talk about my paper, which tries to attempts to unpack the halal trade networks in the Belt and Road Initiative, China's halal trade networks in the Belt and Road Initiative from a political economy angle. So for the background, the usually the economic cooperation and agreements in the BRI are seen as an interstate cooperation perspective, particularly from government to government perspectives. However, one of the weakness of such approach is that it tries to deny or covers the agency of local actors, particularly the local religious actors inside mainland China. However, it is necessary for us to acknowledge that China's religious actors are not they are not functioning or they are not living in isolation. Since the opening of China in 1978, different foreign missionaries were able to come back, particularly Christian and Islamic missionaries, the Dawa movements, particularly through the gateways in the southern provinces. And in order to demonstrate my argument, I use the case of the halal export economy in China as an example, because it is a field wherein the the entanglement of state, business, and religious interests are present. So why should we look at the halal export economy of China? So since the implementation of the BRI in 2013, China has sponsored different trade networks in South Asia and towards West Asia, such as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the China-Central Asia-West Asia Economic Corridor. And in fact, even before the establishment or implementation of the BRI in 2013, China has been reaching out to several Arab states for foreign investments. And lately, we learned about China's increasing role in the Middle Eastern region, particularly its brokerage between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And as recorded by the present literature, we are now acknowledging the increasing presence of Chinese people in the Arab region, particularly in the UAE. So in order for me to unpack the halal export economy, I use a social conflict approach in political economy in understanding the halal economy of China. I refer to it as halal economy because halal is not a single industry. It's very wide. It's more of an very wide ecosystem that covers food, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and even services. And in fact, I learned lately that in Indonesia, even appliances right now are now being halal certified, which is kind of logical because halal production requires even the capital used for production should be religiously sanctioned. So I look at the halal export economy of China from a social conflict perspective that asserts that capitalist development is contradictory and results to conflicting social groups within a specific national political economy. And because of this conflicts and uneven distribution of resources, institutions are becoming sites of conflict among the social groups. And social conflict is usually defined by the entanglements of social characteristics like class, age, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and geography. I think or I deem that such approach is applicable um, because there's this I'm building from the existing literature about the recent literature about China's economy and foreign affairs, particularly the state transformation literature that argued that China is in order to understand China's behavior in international affairs, we need to start acknowledging that China is no longer a unitary actor, but because of the economic transformations brought by globalization and neoliberalization, there's this phenomenon of decentralization, fragmentation, and internationalization of local units. I applied this social conflict approach in China's halal export economy because of the following premises. Number one, because of the opening up in 1978 and China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001, existing literature recorded an uneven geographical development inside the country, wherein the central and western provinces are kind of catching up compared to the southeastern provinces. And then I also noticed that there's, again, disparity in terms of relations and access to resources and access to political networks in Beijing, particularly among Muslim groups. And as stated also in the literature, there's this the business dominance of Hui Muslims over other Muslim ethnic groups within China. And then I also recorded here what I call the formal halal economy and informal halal economy inside China, wherein formal halal economy refers to industrial players who seek halal certification from halal certification bodies, while the informal halal economy are those Muslim-owned businesses that are they say that they are Muslim, so they already know the specificities and the complexity of halal, and they just put there's Arabic word in their restaurants, but there's no third party auditing body that assures that okay, this restaurant is really compliant to the Islamic principles that says that this is halal and permissible to be consumed by Muslims. Also, another group that I identified as conflicting has something to do with the Hui and Han-owned or managed halal economies, wherein existing ethnographic accounts states that Hui-owned businesses in China are usually in the agricultural sector, while the manufacturing and the exportation are mostly, not really all, but mostly are owned by Han Chinese. And then because of this conflictual relations, it is also part of the broader social relationship inside China that has something to do with the central provincial relations, particularly with the relations between the central government and Beijing, the autonomous regions, and other catch-up regions that also want to participate in halal exportation, such as Shanxi, Gansu, Qinghai, Zhejiang, and Chengdu. And then in terms of international actors that are right now competing within China, I'm not saying that these are the only two, but they are the dominant players since the early 2000s, Malaysia and UAE. These enumerated actors are not acting in isolation. In fact, they have their relationships that can be considered as coalitions. Later, I will present why. And then most of the time, these actors are entangled with different social characteristics. like a Hui Muslim being a company owner or a Hui Muslim being an appointed official or is a party cadre assigned in the local autonomous region. So my methodology here is qualitative, and I try to reconstruct the history of China's halal export economy, basing from the following sources. Number one is the Halal Focus website, which serves a good database for all media articles about halal around the world. And then the Halal Times, which is like a contender of this Halal Focus website. And then secondary literature about Hui Muslims in China. I divided my analysis into two parts. Number one is the pre-BRI period, and then the second one is the current one, the BRI period from 2013 to present. In the pre-BRI period, I found the following patterns. Number one, there's a convergence between the economic interest between Beijing and the Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region, that Beijing favored Ningxia and supported Ningxia's efforts to be considered as China's halal capital, in which from this period, from 2005 until 2012, Ningxia has been able to host several international halal exhibits, conferences that were attended by representatives, government representatives, and business representatives from Muslim countries in Malaysia, Indonesia, and other Arab countries. And in this case, the collaboration between the Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region with these Muslim countries, one of the most successful is its collaboration with Malaysia-based halal stakeholders, particularly the JAKIM and HDC in Malaysia. JAKIM is the sole halal certification authority in Malaysia, while the HDC is like a support agency for Malaysia to achieve its bid to become the one of the halal global hub in the world. In this case, I argue in my paper that this mutual interest between Ningxia and Malaysia during this period has something to do or rooted from the internal social conflict between these two countries. In the social conflict of China, as I've discussed, there's this business dominance of Hui, and then the relationship between Beijing, Ningxia, and the other catching up provinces in terms of halal exportation. And during this period in Malaysia, there's also this social conflict among Muslim social groups inside Malaysia, particularly the question who will be or particularly with the bid of some of the Chinese companies in Malaysia who are interested to export in halal, to participate in halal export, that there's this conflict inside during this time that some are pro-JAKIM and some are pro-HDC. The conflict was only settled in 2010 when Malaysia passed a law to settle that conflict, that debate. And then I also noted here that it's wrong to assume that there are that other provinces in China are not also participating in halal. It's just that there's this convergence between Beijing and Ningxia. Other efforts from other provinces such as Xinjiang with other Turkish businesses. There's also network that were formed, and Henan. And then during this time, there's the establishment of China's first considered internationally recognized halal certification body, which is the Ningxia International Halal Food Certification Center. And the creation of this halal certification body is facilitated or helped by Malaysia. And during this time, during 2011 to 2012, was also the first joint venture between Ningxia and Malaysia, which is through the Ningxia Fahim International Halal Industry Corporation. As I mentioned in the bullet here, there's this, as I have said, I argued in this time or in this period that it was Malaysia who prepared China to become, who prepared and assisted, improve and develop China's halal export economy. Then came the BRI period. So the Ningxia-Malaysia coalition is still here, but there are already some contenders with Ningxia's dominance inside China. such as Iwu City, which became the preferred investment destination of Saudi Arabian businessmen, and also the entrance of Singapore and Brunei for halal certification process purposes. So in the pre-BRI period, you have the JAKIM and HDC entering Malaysia, but now in Singapore, their own halal certification body created a foreign company called the Waris Halal, so that this will be like the Singaporean representative towards China that will offer halal certification services towards Chinese halal companies, particularly in Ningxia and the western regions. And then Brunei also came into the picture. Other provinces commenced also to network and internationalize their local halal companies. And then these provinces are this one, sorry. The following provinces who are now participating are Ningxia, Shanxi, Yunnan, Gansu, Qinghai, Henan, Sichuan, and Tianjin. And in 2013 and 2015, these provinces decided to craft a unified mutual halal certification scheme, which is very important in order for businesses in order to have a ease of doing businesses, particularly in halal production, so that businesses can go or avail the nearest halal certification body within their territory. With this step, this provincial governments hoped and attempted to lobby to Beijing to introduce a national halal law because of two problems. Number one is that there's this problem of mislabeling, which is present in the informal halal economy, because there's no third-party auditor who will ascertain that, okay, the production and process is halal certified. It's just, okay, I self-declare that my restaurant is halal. So there's this like problem of mislabeling. And then the other one is that these provinces, the Huawei-owned and Han-owned companies inside China are lobbying their provincial governments to help them to seek more international markets abroad. So unfortunately, if Beijing will introduce a national halal law, it will mainstream halal in the market, and the increasing presence of halal certified products in the market has alarmed a certain population of Han Chinese inside China. And we all know that the priority of Beijing usually is the political stability. So in order to arrest such problem, Beijing refused to legislate a national halal law, and one of the implications of such refusal is the disbandment of this unified halal certification scheme around 2020 and the closure of the Ningxia International Halal Foods Certification Center. This diagram tries to capture what happened from kind of messy, but it tries to capture what I said from the pre-BRI period and to the current BRI period. And I argue in my paper that the refusal of Beijing to introduce a national halal law to police halal certification inside China has resulted to China missing out to new developments and opportunities in the global halal trade, because China-based halal certification bodies are not recognized or are having difficulty to get international recognition abroad. And that is the key in the global halal trade. Last slide. That is the key in the global halal trade. The certification and logo that a product bears must be recognized in the regulatory agencies of halal export destination countries. So final note on China-based HCBs. There's still halal certification bodies inside China. Some of them are local offices of the China Islamic Association, or some of them are private bodies but are incorporated in the provincial government. And there are four mechanisms that China can, or right now, these China-based halal certification bodies can pursue. Number one, they can apply direct accreditation to the regulatory agencies of Muslim countries like JAKIM, MUWI, and the Gulf Cooperation Council Accreditation Center. And then there are actually a number of China-based HCBs there, like China Islamic Association, Shandong HCS, Chongqing Halal Certification Services. Second, these HCBs should forge mutual recognition arrangements with another HCB located abroad. So in my research, I found out that Chongqing Halal Certification Services enjoys mutual recognitions with some in Europe and South Asia. Second, inter-HCB mutual recognition. And then the third one is membership in international halal bodies, which is actually the most preferred the most preferred method by being member of the World Halal Council or the World Halal Food Council. Certain China-based halal HCB is a member of the World Halal Council, which is located in Shanxi, but its status is only associate member. I am quite skeptic about whether a Chinese HCB will be a member of the World Halal Food Council, because the World Halal Food Council has a Taiwanese member inside, and then MUI Indonesia, the MUI is a member of World Halal Council, and since the pre-BRI period, the MUI is kind of skeptic about the quality of halal products in China. That's all, and please help me. My paper is still rough, so I hope you can still help me to improve my paper. Thank you.
Thank Brian for his wonderful research. And now let's invite Jiang Xiaokun to share his research on Chinese Salafi Muslim immigrants in Malaysia.
Okay, thank you all for being here and being awake, and thank everyone, especially Professor Palmer, whose effort to make this conference happen. And thank you, Jules, for your introduction of me. And today, the topic of my presentation is the question of allegiance for Chinese Salafi Muslim immigrants in Malaysia. As many of you may know, that there are many Muslims from China who are living in Malaysia these days. And the intricate dynamics of the Chinese Muslim communities in Malaysia have emerged as a subject of scholarly inquiry across various research fields. Notably, though, existing research primarily concentrates on local Chinese Malaysian Muslims, or the so-called Huaren, rather than to Chinese Muslim immigrants, or the 中国人. So this article seeks to contribute to addressing this gap in research by offering some insights into the latter, the Chinese Muslim immigrants, especially focusing on the Salafis among them. The reason for choosing the Salafis as a subject partly lies in the fact that in terms of religiosity, the Salafis often bear the most manifest influence of it. On the other hand, they're also the focus of my PhD project, so they're the group of Muslims that I am most familiar with. And by examining the interplay between religious beliefs and daily life experiences of Chinese Salafis, particularly in relation to the notion of Bay'ah, this article seeks to contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of the ideological world of Chinese Muslims within the context of transnational religion. Additionally, this research also adds to the scholarship on global Salafism by exploring its manifestation in local contexts. And And this article draws on a combination of first-hand data and second-hand literature. The first-hand data was collected by myself through semi-structured interviews conducted on-site during my fieldwork trip in Malaysia in May 2022, as well as through formal or informal online conversations and publications by prominent Chinese Salafi figures. And the second-hand literature includes scholarly works and public media contents. So who are they? What are Chinese Salafis? And even who are the Salafis? There has been a serious debate about the definition of Salafism, and it can be really difficult for researchers to decide who are the Salafis at times during our researches. Still, there are some identifiable aqaids or principles that all Salafis tend to agree upon. And these include the central importance of the all-encompassing principle of Tawheed, or the oneness of Allah, of God, and a scripturally theological stance inherited from the classical times, a particular position on jurisprudence, emphasizing the authority of sacred texts and ijtihad, or innovation, over taqlid, or blind imitation of any of the four established schools of Islamic law, and also a distinctive way of life based on the concept of wala wal bara'a, or loyalty and disavowal. Meanwhile, since the Salafis do differ in their manhaj, or the methods, that is the specific ways to put their beliefs into practice, it also makes a lot of sense to pay attention to the internal distinctions among the Salafis. According to US Wahamarker's categorization, which is based on the Salafist views on politics, there are three broad types of Salafi groups: the quietists, the politicals, and the jihadis. Using Wahamarker's classification, I categorize the majority of Chinese Salafi immigrants in Malaysia as quietists, since neither parliamentary politics nor social activism is within the scope of their consideration. And on the other hand, a small group of individuals are labeled by me as politicals, as they believe in the correctness of participating in politics and could provide religious justifications for such participation, although in real life they lack the access to any channel through which they could translate their belief into action. And notably, the Chinese Salafi immigrant community in Malaysia demonstrates little to no inclination towards jihadism. Now let's have a look at the bay'ah question. So what does bay'ah mean? In classical Islamic terminology, bay'ah refers to the ritual where the subjects pledge allegiance to the ruler, that is the Prophet Muhammad, and the caliphs who succeeded his worldly power. It is a commonly held view among Islamic scholars that the oath of bay'ah is binding upon anyone who has pledged the oath, requiring absolute allegiance to the ruler and punishable with death penalty in case of violation. But after the caliphate collapsed in the early 20th century, in the modern era, though, the original meaning of bay'ah became obsolete because there is no longer a caliph to pledge to. However, the notion is still actively used in adapted ways depending on the context. For example, radical Islamist groups leaders exploit the term's implication of absolute political power in their descriptions of the relationship between themselves and their followers. Meanwhile, some quietist Salafis, rejecting the usage promoted by the radical violent groups, argue that bay'ah should only be given to the ruler instead of some organizational leaders. And by ruler, they really mean the presidents or kings of their own countries. Okay, it is worth noticing that in both classical times and modern times, the term bay'ah, which means nothing more than a religious ritual meant for the provision of political legitimacy, has always been used in connection with a group of interrelated political notions. It is just like, as the philosopher Wittgenstein's words, a game of language that forms a family of resemblances. What does it mean? So when people talk about bay'ah, they not only refer to the Pledge of Allegiance itself, but also they would implicitly or explicitly show their understandings of a series of notions that are within the family of resemblances to the notion of bay'ah. In the language games, that is, in the discourses in which bay'ah is referred to, these notions gain the connectedness that make people feel natural to consider them in a collective manner. Moreover, the boundary that marks the extension of the family of resemblances is not a static one. And such fluidity of the family of resemblances could be witnessed in the group of notions related to bay'ah when Chinese Salafis in Malaysia use the term in their talks about real politics and reflect upon their own living conditions. When they do that, they could mention something very different compared to their co-religionists in the Middle East. Generally speaking, the concept of bay'ah is rarely incorporated in the discourse of Chinese Salafis when they reside in China. Because, like, similar to other countries where Salafism is a security concern for the state, there is limited space for deliberating political allegiance due to the patriotic narrative promoted by the Chinese party state. However, when Chinese Salafis move to other regions or other countries, for example, Malaysia, the situation changes significantly. In Malaysia, the room becomes greater for open discussion on the issues which could otherwise be too politically sensitive to be covered if they're still living in China. And as a result, the notion of bay'ah, together with a series of concepts that share family resemblance to the term, enters the available vocabulary of the Chinese Salafi immigrants. For now, I'll just skip the quotations from my notes of the interviews and skip to the points. So, according to what my interviews say, it's it's quite obvious that they are very familiar with the historical significance and the original meaning of the term bay'ah, that is the ritual that affirms the caliph's political legitimacy. Moreover, they're also adding another layer of main meaning to the term within the contemporary context. The caliphate is something of the past, but the allegiance can still be offered to the ummah, or the global Muslim community. In this way, bay'ah transforms into more than a mere ritual. It turns into a symbolic position or a gesture, reflecting one's dedication to the universal Muslim community in the name of Allah and His Prophet Muhammad. Interestingly, in contrast, in the Middle East, the term bay'ah has been downgraded in many cases to denote allegiance to certain rulers of political entities or leaders of organizations. One possible explanation to this of this discrepancy is that in both historical and modern times, the actual practice of bay'ah has always been relatively unfamiliar to Chinese Muslims. It's not that they do not know what the term means; they know very well, and but it is just that the practice is culturally and politically detached from their daily lives and holds little functional significance beyond the terminology through which one tacitly and symbolically offers their allegiance to a community whose significance is more imagined than experienced. And consequently, an abstract interpretation and symbolic utilization of the term bay'ah are more prevalent. And the Chinese Salafi specific way of understanding and using the term bay'ah also implies a hierarchical structure in their attitudes towards different political agents. This hierarchy encompasses a set of ideas that are closely intertwined with the concept of bay'ah, that means within the family of resemblances, and often mentioned in conjunction with it. According to the prevailing Salafi view on politics, where ultimate sovereignty rests solely with Allah, notions like, for example, the rule of people or the self-governance are regarded questionable at best and unacceptable at worst. Within this framework, there is always an entity acting on behalf of God, other than those who are governed, that assumes the role of ruling. Consequently, when residing in a state as a lawful resident or citizen, questions naturally arise regarding the nature of the relationship or the perceived relationship between the governed and the governing authorities for Muslims and for Salafis in specific. When applicable, bay'ah provides a definitive answer to the question of political allegiance, creating a form of contract between the ruler and their subjects, and that in theory is nearly unbreakable, and in practice is generally obeyed by the majority, if not all. However, as mentioned above, the Chinese Salafis restrict the application of bay'ah to the symbolic realm, and the qualification of bay'ah is frequently mentioned alongside a critical attitude towards contemporary rulers, portraying them as unfit and unworthy of bay'ah. They would all agree that no one at present deserves their unconditional and genuine allegiance anymore. However, the divergence between contemporary rulers and the ideal recipients of bay'ah do not render the rulers themselves illegitimate at all. That is because in the Sunni tradition, the concept of perfectionism has never been a criterion for determining whether a ruler deserves the obedience of their subjects. According to certain religious scholars, even unjust rulers can be deemed worthy of obedience under certain conditions, as long as they do not openly advocate anti-Islamic laws or commit blasphemy. So, for the Chinese Salafi immigrants in Malaysia, who unanimously adhere to this quietist tradition, obedience, or ta'a in Arabic, is certainly also a highly emphasized principle. However, just as they distinguish contemporary political figures from the ideal entities deserving of bay'ah, they also exhibit varying attitudes toward different objects of obedience or ta'a. Here, a hierarchical structure can be identified. In this hierarchy, the historical ideal rulers deserving of bay'ah, including the Prophet and the first four caliphs, takes the place of the highest level. And the next level consists of rulers who are less worthy but still considered legitimate. Among them, there are those who are deemed better, to whom ta'a is granted with little doubt, and even spontaneous nasiha or advising to them is at times acceptable. And conversely, there are also rulers regarded to be worse than them, and obedience to them is only justified by certain convictions, such as a belief that the division of community is less acceptable than tyranny, or due to practical limitations that make resistance against them not a good choice. And although only mentioned in really rare cases, there are also the ones whose legitimacy is totally denied. All right, so When it comes to this hierarchical structure, it is understandable that the concerns of the Chinese Salafi immigrants primarily revolve around their country of origin and host country. This assumption is true. Meanwhile, it is also commonly presumed that their decision to immigrate signifies their discontent and grievances against the Chinese state, indicating a more negative attitude towards the Chinese government compared to the Malaysian government and state. Interestingly, though, this presumption proves to be somewhat inaccurate. So generally speaking, the dissatisfaction of certain religious policies implemented by the Chinese state is quite prevalent among the Chinese Salafis who are living in Malaysia. And such grievances appeared repeatedly in the author's interviews in Malaysia, but they do not necessarily translate into total denial of the Chinese state's legitimacy. Only in rare cases is the legitimacy of the ruler or the state put into question by certain Chinese Salafis. However, even in those cases, restraint and endurance is still preferred to insurrection. Anyway, according to the perspectives of Chinese Salafis, China and its ruler occupy a position that clearly falls in their hierarchy of the political entities, clearly falls below the highest level of excellence, but still remains within the sphere of entities deemed worthy of obedience, despite discontent arising from certain religious policies. For some, the Chinese state is not only deemed acceptable, but also regarded as having positive characteristics deserving of people's affection. Others may not ascribe as many positive attributes to it, but still acknowledge its legitimacy to varying degrees depending on their specific views and perceptions. On the other hand, the Chinese Salafi immigrants exhibit a mix of feelings and delicate attitudes towards Malaysia. They highly appreciate the freedom of speech and convenience of practicing their religion in the country. However, their views on the religious credibility and fairness of the Malaysian state are not uniformly positive. Some individuals hold the ruling authority in high esteem and actively collaborate with state-sponsored Dawah organizations to promote Islamic national culture and identity among Malaysians. Conversely, others express discontent to such an extent that they even deny the Islamic nature, last slide, of the Malaysian state. And such discontent mirrors the prevalent national image of Malaysia perceived by most Chinese Muslim immigrants. Malaysia is primarily seen as a Malay state rather than a Muslim one, a perception that aligns with reality to a significant extent. This sentiment also highlights the struggles faced by many Chinese Muslim immigrants in Malaysia, especially the Salafis. And really, it's the last slide. And such perspectives of the Chinese Salafi immigrants reveal that the systematic injustice caused by the Bumi Putera first or native first state policies of Malaysia and the resulting rigid cultural dichotomy or separation do have an effect on the views of the Chinese Salafi immigrants. They do not only pose challenges in their daily lives, but also hinders the development of affectional bonds with the Malaysian state. And also, there is another significant factor contributing to this effect. It is the citizenship. I'm not talking about the ideological tendency for Salafis to deny citizenship to any specific political entity. I'm talking about real politics, because the Malaysian immigration system does not grant foreigners permanent or long-term residency except under really strict and often impractical conditions that no one could literally meet. And here's my conclusion. I have to say, I really anticipate further research concentrating on Muslim immigrants with similar denominational backgrounds in other countries, focusing on their political views, exploring their established networks and daily application of their practice. And such studies would offer additional comparative perspectives, enabling a deeper comprehension of these individuals and their experiences. Thank you.
Thank you for Xiaokun's research, which is really rich in content. Now, let's welcome Alvin Camba to share with us his presentation.
It's obviously last minute. You can see the email. Um, well, hi everybody. Good morning. Apologies for this like last minute PowerPoint. Technically, it's not a PowerPoint. It's something I had to make from a program, so it takes a while to sort of edit it and sort of put it down. So good morning. Thank you for being in this presentation. My presentation looks at Indigenous religiosity and cosmologies, how Indigenous groups mobilize against Chinese dams in the Philippines. Thank you, David. Thank you, Lunar, for organizing. I appreciate like being here. Now, my research question is, I'm going to skip the outline because I'm going to talk about it anyway. My research question is, how do indigenous groups mobilize against large-scale Chinese projects in the global south? Now, to flag my argument quickly, although I'm going to talk about the argument a bit later, I argue that indigenous groups draw from their cosmologies and religious practices to mobilize against these two large Chinese dams being built in the Philippines. They illustrate three mechanisms: boundary formation, historical framing, and reconceptualization. Now, I can talk about the three concepts later, but I'm just going to go about this quickly. The literature on Chinese capital, and I include myself here as well, broadly looks at three different things. We can talk about Chinese capital broadly. Qingquan Li's The Specter of Global China. There's Emily Ye, who talks about the Belt and Road Initiative, the idea of autocrats, in her words, not mine. Autocrats have the argument about like ambiguity, how it's reinterpreted by local actors. There's an argument by Ho Fung Hong, who was my advisor at Johns Hopkins, who talks about overcapacity and exporting capital abroad. So the Belt and Road Initiative largely looks at it from this like Chinese lens. Now, more development scholars look at the ramifications of Belt and Road projects. They look at it economically, they look at it politically, they look at it environmentally. Most works in DC actually sort of look at this these days. Now, there's a final literature, host country responses, and I include myself here. People in the host country responses look at the agency of local actors and like local elites and how they hijack and they modify Chinese projects when they start getting implemented and being built in the global south. Now, despite these three literatures, there are three problems here. I think the first one is the literature on Chinese capital and Belt and Road is not specific to indigenous groups or ethnic minorities, especially when they look at violence. Of course, there is a literature that links social conflict and Belt and Road altogether, but the literature is largely broad. It looks at host country actors in a broad way. It doesn't look at ethnic minorities or indigenous groups specifically. Number two, the literature erases the agency of indigenous groups. The literature often favors host country actors, national governments, local elites. It looks at communities, people who belong to the majority, but it excludes indigenous people's organizations or indigenous groups in the global south. What I do in this paper, and this is a working draft, is I try to bring out the agency of indigenous groups by examining how they use religion. Going back again, my argument is indigenous groups draw on their cosmologies and religious practices to mobilize against these two large Chinese dams. I talk about three mechanisms. Boundary formation points to the hardening boundaries between indigenous groups and non-indigenous group Filipinos and the strengthening of ties amongst indigenous groups themselves. Historical framing pertains to framing large-scale Chinese projects within a longer time frame of host country oppression. Indigenous groups in the Philippines frame the large-scale Chinese projects, not just what's happening today, not just with like their dealings with these large Chinese firms, but it actually goes back to how the Japanese, the Americans, and the Spanish colonized the Philippines and actually empowered a group of Filipinos to sort of take control of the entire country. That includes the Tagalogs, the Cebuanos, the Bicolanos, etc. And finally, reconceptualization refers to forming symmetric identities with non-indigenous Filipinos and non-member Filipinos. Now, mind you, the first and the third mechanism actually contradict each other to some degree, but I try to sort of like put them together in this paper. Now, what is my methods of data collection? So Since I started my PhD, I've been doing field work in, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, looking at Chinese projects. Specifically for this project, I did a 3-month field work in northern and central Luzon in late 2019 and early 2020. I did 24 interviews with indigenous peoples. I do not speak their language, admittedly. I had to rely on a translator who actually are studying in local universities. And right now I'm trying to get them a scholarship to study in the United States. I've done observations of protests and mobilizations and multiple conversations with approximately 20 to 30 members. I have to admit, though, there are major limitations of like somebody like myself going into these places and talking to indigenous peoples. I'm Filipino. I'm Filipino Chinese specifically. I grew up in the Philippines for 12 years before moving to the United States. I've lived like more than 3/4 of my life outside the Philippines. Going back to the Philippines, of course, presents distance. It presents issues. It presents like power asymmetries. I try to be careful of that. I try to sort of like I try to like understand my own like power relations in relation to indigenous peoples, and in light of that, I do believe there are insights that we can draw from them in order to understand how they use religion to mobilize against large-scale Chinese projects. The framework is fairly simple. David, I have to admit, I'm a political economist, so this framework is outside my comfort zone. Religion for me is an identity-making project. But more than an identity-making project, it is an ethnicity and race-making exercise. A lot of indigenous peoples, they see the practice of religion as something that separates themselves from other Filipinos who may or may not share their genetic, I would say, symmetry. But at the same time, they sort of see themselves as we're different because we practice this religion. Filipinos practice Christianity, Moros practice Islam, and Americans practice, I don't know, whatever, whatever they think they practice. But more importantly, and this goes back to actually to Emily's point yesterday, exercise of religion as forms of capital and the reproduction of identities occur in the context of large-scale transformations. Now, slightly spinning Emily's point yesterday, the Belt and Road Initiative is not just a question of what China is doing in the world, but the Belt and Road Initiative is a question of winners and losers in the host country. Some host country actors, Filipinos, some of them are going to win from working with China, some of them are going to lose. And in the context of large-scale Chinese dams that prioritize the government and firms, and I would say most Filipinos, I wouldn't say most Filipinos, people who are in the losing end are going to be people who are already losing in the global south. Indigenous peoples have been dealing with violence, structural violence from Filipinos for, I would say, more than 50 years, more than 100 years. And what the Chinese projects are doing are exacerbating that particular situation, specifically because of the financing apparatus provided to host country leaders very, very easily when compared to financing from the World Bank or Western sources. This is a paper I did that actually talks about the Chinese dams, how Duterte strong-armed Chinese builders but weaken Philippine institutions. So I'm going to skip the details about the Chinese dams, the sort of like the financing apparatus, the Chinese firms. I'm more than happy to talk about them if you're interested. But I'm just going to go to the indigenous peoples quickly, just to talk about the paper. Now the Philippine case, I would say, is a very good case to talk about Chinese dams in the Philippines. It vacillates between a relatively friendly Chinese government to China during the Arroyo and the Duterte administrations, a relatively hostile government towards China with the Aquino administration, and right now, to some degree, the Bongbong Marcos administration. Chinese projects actually come in quite a bit during friendly governments, and Chinese projects are kept out during unfriendly governments. So it's a perfect case study to sort of understand when Chinese projects actually come in. More importantly, when I did fieldwork in 2019, projects were actually coming in, getting implemented at that time, and indigenous groups were mobilizing against the Chinese projects in the Philippines. In other words, it was a perfect opportunity to sort of see what was happening at that time because they were mobilizing. In contrast, if I come like 3 years after, 5 years after, 10 years after, the mobilization aspects would have disappeared because they would no longer be mobilizing. They would have been either they would either be successful or they would either be like kicked out of their lands, which actually happened in 2022. I'm going to skip this. If you're interested in more details, you can look at the paper or the Carnegie paper. Just for some update, the Kaliwa Dam is 60% complete. Chico River Pump Irrigation Project was completed during the pandemic in 2022. May I request to know like how much time I have left? Oh, perfect. I'm going to talk about the empirical cases now. As you can see, I'm very comfortable talking about the projects and the political economy aspects of it. But being a non-religion person, this is where my comfort zone actually comes to, my comfort zone like ends. Um, yeah, so briefly on the projects, people, I mean, I really disagree with this idea that, and I'm one of the people pushing this in the literature that, China imposes projects in the global south and it creates problems. What I sort of see happening in many parts of the global south is that host country elites hijack Chinese projects and use Chinese projects towards their own ends. China to some degrees, of course, complicit in this situation, but host country elites by and large are guilty of the situations. In the case of the two dams, Rodrigo Duterte was using the Kaliwa Dam to reward Philippine military elites. And that actually strengthens his political power and expands his political survival. And Rodrigo Duterte was using the Chico River Pump Irrigation Project to reward the Northern Cagayan elites who wanted free water from the particular river so they can subsidize fruit exports. That actually goes to dragon fruits, rambutan, longyan, and what's this? The smelly one? Durian, and get actually exported to China afterwards. So it actually goes back to host country situations in many ways. Now, talking about the two groups, they're very different. The Kalinga group is politically empowered to some degree, 120,000. They have local representatives. They've delved into occupations outside hunting and foraging. They've done many different things from services to getting in the market economy, etc. They live in like really nice, sort of like comfortable villages where I've actually stayed, and they're actually quite big, relatively speaking, for an indigenous groups. The Dumagat Remontado are much more, I would say, it's a bleaker situation. There's only around 3,000 of them left. A lot of them do hunting and foraging. A lot of them until now are still dealing with problems when it comes to, I would say, marginalization in their specific areas. Most of them do hunting. Now, what are the three mechanisms that I found? Hardening of boundaries. In talking to a Kalinga elder, hardening of boundaries, again, is when they strengthen their boundaries towards other Filipinos, non-Indigenous Filipinos, and they strengthen the boundaries amongst themselves, members of the Kalinga group. At the same time, they strengthen their boundaries towards other Indigenous groups who are also marginalized in the Philippines. According to the Kalinga elder, our worship and our practices, we ask our supreme deity to guide and honor us, to give back our water and peace that were taken from us by the Taga-Bukid, which basically means people like Tagalogs, the mainstream, sort of the majority Filipinos. In talking to the Dumagat Remontado elder, in our worships, according to her, we emphasize how we've been oppressed historically, how we are different from everybody else. The government does not respect our cultures and practices. This project from the Chinese is a manifestation of this lack of respect towards their cultures and practices. The second mechanism of historical framing, according to the Kalinga religious elder, the Marcos government wanted to build a dam funded by the World Bank that led to her people mobilizing against the Philippine government despite the military smite. That's a bit messy, but the Chico River Dam was a historical project that was actually built by Ferdinand Marcos back in the 70s. And the way that the Kalinga elderly saw this was this is a continuation of this historical oppression by the Philippine government towards the Kalinga people. This is, in their words, different forms of oppressors, from the Americans to the World Bank. Now it's going to be the Chinese, and it's an encroachment on their lands, religion, traditions, and in the concept of umbalod, which basically pertains to being one with nature and the relationship of the Kalinga towards the specific their specific like habitat. According to the Dumagat Remontado, this is a desecration of our sacred spaces at a much greater scale than all the other invaders before. By and large, because the physical infrastructure being built by the Chinese government is really just far larger than anybody else is building. The Germans are building similar dams, except they're much, much smaller because of capital. Relying on the capital market inflows is unsustainable and like limited to some degree. Now, there are different ways in which they engage in sacred spaces, which is really interesting. I talk about it in the paper, but I don't have time to talk about it right now. But if you want to talk about it later, I'm more than happy to engage with it. And finally, I'm sorry, this is messy. They have a concept called Kaista and Yalo. For the Kalinga, the Kaista is a way that you can celebrate things with everybody. You can celebrate it through eating. You can celebrate Kaista through festivals, through the festival, through eating and drinking together, you create a symmetric identity that allows you to forward your goals And this particular goal is the mobilization against the Chinese projects. The KIHSS was done in alongside other Filipinos who don't belong to the indigenous group, but this is a way that they reconceptualize their identities and actually create allies against the Chinese projects. For the Dumagat Rementado, they have something called Yalok, which is a dance that they perform, which is not a celebratory festival, it's a dance. And the dance is something that they also share food there, along with other Filipinos who are similarly aligned against the Chinese project. This was a demonstration of the religious practice and religious belief when they were mobilizing against both Chinese dams. Now, just to sum this up, see, key takeaways. I'm already in my conclusion at my 15-minute. Just to sum it up quickly, unfortunately, the dams, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not going to get into the debate whether it's positive or negative. I don't want to do that here. But it's the Chico River Dam was successful, and they built the dam, so it's there right now. The Kalinga people, some of them were basically kicked out of their lands. The Kaliwa Dam is 60% complete. The Dumagat Rementado people have been literally kicked out of their sacred lands as well. So the protests have been unsuccessful, yet these were the mechanisms that I found when they were mobilizing. And to make three points, what the paper does, it brings out the agency of indigenous groups and the importance of religion. I show three mechanisms: boundary formation, historical framing, and reconceptualization. And we need more studies on religions and indigenous groups. That links the Belt and Road altogether. So David, more power to you in getting more funding so we can fly people like me to Hong Kong once again. Thank you very much.
Thank Alvin for bringing us such interesting and insightful research. And now let's move to the discussion section. And now I'll invite our three speakers to come to the front and have a seat. And then I'll welcome Dr. Orlando Woods to comment on their research. Yesterday, I saw Orlando write a lot of comment on their papers. He has done a lot of wonderful research, so I believe he will give you very insightful comment. Thank you.
On the contrary, I was trying to get up to speed with some of the homework I should have done maybe slightly earlier. Anyway, I think I echo the sentiments of everyone that's spoken here before me when I want to extend my thanks to everyone, especially David and especially Luna for all the organization. I mean, I think many of us here, I think many of us will have been involved in organizing conferences in the past, and it's a nightmare, to put it simply. So thank you very much for all your work. It's also really nice to be back here in person, right? I don't know about you, but I'm sick of Zoom workshops and conferences. So actually the magic of being together in person, I'm really feeling it this time. It's great. Let me just start with a couple of caveats, which I call covering my arse, basically. So as Julius mentioned when he gave my introduction, I'm actually a geographer. And so that means various things. But to me, it means that I'm quite a simple person and I don't have the kind of the level of ethnographic insights that many of you guys have in particular. I also know absolutely nothing about Malaysia or the Philippines or Islam or indigenous communities or anything like that. So thank you, David, for putting me with this group. I will try my best not to sound too stupid. But in all seriousness, because of this, my responses and my remarks are actually going to be quite conceptual. So I'm not going to be talking about the intricacies of the countries that we're looking at, but I'm going to try and tie them together through more of a conceptual lens. So I want to talk about three things in these remarks. The first thing I want to do is to offer my sort of overview of each paper and try and distill each one down to the real core of what it's about, just so you have an idea of how I see them, how I understand them. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to do is I want to offer three themes, which I think sort of bind them together in different ways. And actually, when I present these themes to you, I hope you'll notice that it's not just these papers, but actually papers from a lot of the other discussions that maybe fit into these frameworks that I'm putting forward. And the final thing I want to do is just to pose some questions to the authors, maybe just to kickstart the discussion. Maybe you can just ignore them. It's up to you how you want to use this. Okay, let me start by reviewing each paper. So Brian's paper about China's halal trade networks and this very important sub-state analysis is very well taken. And I see it as part of bigger efforts to actually provincialize the BRI and what it is. So in my interpretation, this is a paper that's all about scale, and a word that Emily used to good effect yesterday, the slippages between these different scales of activity, meaning, power, relationships, and so forth. We've got the national level, the state level, we've got the subnational, the sub-state, we've got what's going on in China, what's going on in Malaysia, what's going on in the Middle East. And so all of these different scales coming in and interacting with each other, that creates this kind of messy matrix of power and influence and the slippages that they give rise to. We can also scale the discussion up and actually think about, this is a paper about global China coming into contact with global Islam, right? And actually it's the market that provides this connective interface through which these global power dynamics come into contact and interact with each other. So that's how I see Brian's paper about scales and slippages. Secondly, Xiaokun's paper about the question of allegiance, right? The question of allegiance with Chinese Salafi Muslims in Malaysia. So to me, I disagree. I don't think this is a question of allegiance. I think this is a question of belonging. And why I say that is because I think with belonging, I actually want to maybe foreground more than you do the actual role of migration and the actual role of living out of place, living outside of your home country. It's not just about belonging, it's about belonging and citizenship. And I think we've got this really interesting waxing and waning of religious citizenship as opposed to ethno-racial national citizenship as well. And so again, we've got this messy sort of continuum that the Chinese Salafi migrants that Xiaokun talks about are constantly trying to negotiate and find out where they belong and find a certain belonging. Obviously, this is really interesting in Malaysia because in Malaysia, we have this interlocking relationship between the Malay Muslim identity on the one hand, and this is enshrined through the policy of Bumiputra, as I think most of us know. And so the implication of that is that by default, if you're Chinese and you're Muslim, you're somehow less Muslim than your Malay counterparts. And actually, Xiaokun in his paper, he has this really nice sort of expression that he uses to describe this, which is the limbo of identity, which I really liked that idea. Finally, Alvin. So Alvin's paper is great. I think it's quite a straightforward paper, but that doesn't mean it's no less important than the others and no less innovative than the others. I think the focus on indigenous groups, this is a very trendy topic, and it's something that actually is really important to study. And so it is quite straightforward. The argument is about resistance and agency and all this kind of stuff, but that doesn't diminish it in any way at all. So if Brian's paper is about scales and slippages, Xiaokun's is about belonging and citizenship, in my view. Alvin's, as he knows, I'm just using his words here, they're about agency, but then also authenticity. And I think the idea of authenticity actually speaks directly to the importance of the indigenous communities that you're studying, because what is unique about indigenous communities is this relationship with the land and this relationship with the natural world in which they live, belong, form their belief systems, and so forth. And with that comes a certain degree of authenticity, which is very interesting. And as we saw from Alvin, this leads to a lot of workings and reworkings of power through these negotiations between large-scale infrastructure projects and these indigenous communities. So that's how I see each paper. You may disagree violently with me. I don't care. It's just my perspective, right? But if you understand that, then hopefully you'll understand the themes, the overarching themes that I want to use to try and tie them together. So as I said, I have three. The first is really general and really boring and quite straightforward, but in my view, they gradually get more interesting as I work through them. So the first one, and Prof. Chen, I hope you appreciate this given your own interests. So the first one actually is about how religion enables and obstructs the smooth workings of capital, the smoothness of capital working at a global scale, how capital can bring people together and cleave them apart. And actually religion is a sort of conduit. It's a vessel through which these smoothenings or these frictions can be reproduced. So in the first paper, in Brian's paper, we see religion as a guise through which capital can work. It creates connection and unity through these different scales, and it tries to overcome the slippages that are almost inherent within the halal food industry. In Xiaokun's paper, we've got the same logic of connection, but it's actually one that creates a barrier. It actually obstructs sort of integration and belonging, in my view, because the Chinese are known to be very, good business people. And this is the whole principle of Bumiputra, is to try and contain the influence of the Chinese community there. And then, of course, the same idea, principle of connection and unity. But this is for Alvin's paper, but this is in response to these Chinese mega projects, where actually is bringing people together in opposition to the sort of hegemonic role of global capital coming in to disrupt their communities. So that's my first sort of overarching theme. And again, I saw this resonate very strongly yesterday at the Africa panel, for example, where the smoothening effects of global capital are felt. So that's my first theme. My second theme, which I have to thank Alvin because I just stole it directly from you, which is about boundaries and also limits. And this is actually something that we heard. We had a very spirited discussion yesterday in the Indonesia panel that Emily was serving as discussant for, talking about the limits of Confucianism. Like, what is Confucianism? Where does it start? Where does it stop? What's included? What's not included? But I think this idea of boundaries and limits, it's very important. It can, it can create groups, it can separate groups, it creates regimes of ordering and logic and policing through which you're policing these boundaries, but also creates avenues through which groups can work through the boundaries, work through the interstices of difference, which is kind of interesting, I think. So again, in Brian's paper, we're seeing this ideological boundary between global China and global Islam, right? But we're also seeing this boundary between Islam and the market, and where the sort of the faith-based aspect of religion starts and stops, and when the actual secular workings of capital and the market and business and industry start to take over. And so that begs the question of what are actually the limits of Islam within the halal food industry? But there's also this other really interesting boundary between products and consumers. And I'll come to this later in the question that I posed to you. In Xiaokun's paper, the second paper, this is really interesting because I see the limits of the market and the way that the market is being policed and regulated as something that actually is transposed onto the limits of ethnicity and of belonging and of citizenship. So what I'm actually going to do is quote some of the interlocutors that Xiaokun includes actually in his paper, because I think these quotes are absolutely fascinating and they provide a very good insight into what I mean by this. So the first one is, I've got two. The first one is from Aisha, who is a Salafi businesswoman, I assume Chinese migrant as well. She says, and I quote directly, "I live on trading, not talking or writing. When the country sets barriers for you everywhere in your business, you realize that you are never one of them." Right? She goes from talking the regulation of her industry, of her business, to actually the regulation of her identity and her belonging, and realizing that she is other because of this. She goes on to say, being a Muslim doesn't mean anything to them, the regulators, the government. Being a foreigner is your original sin. Interesting slippage there into Christian theology, but anyway. And being a Chinese is another original sin. So again, just to sort of what that means is we're seeing the regulation of the market leading to the regulation of identity, and this actually creating a barrier to her belonging in the country that she chose to live in. That's the first quote. The second quote is from Abdullah, who is another Salafi, but he's a restaurant owner. I quote directly. He says, "I'm making more money here in Malaysia, capital, smoothing of capital, but I'm not sure this is where I belong." Making money, but he's not sure this is where he belongs. The Malays don't really think we are one of them, nor the local Chinese. This is in fact a Malay state, not a Muslim state. So what this shows in my analysis, in my schema, is that making money actually creates this foundational division that actually obstructs the ability to belong. It creates division, it creates competition, not just between Chinese migrants and their Malay counterparts, but also between Chinese migrants and their Chinese Malaysian counterparts as well, right? And then finally, Alvin's paper, right? So boundaries is something, it's an analytic that you use to very good effect, talking about groups and how actually through the opposition to these Chinese dams, it actually brings communities together that cross otherwise distinctions that may otherwise be there. But I actually think there's another boundary, which to me is even more interesting and comes back to this idea of what is the uniqueness of indigenous communities, right? And this is the boundary between humans and the land and nature, right? And what we're actually seeing is that these Chinese dams, these Chinese infrastructure projects, creating a boundary there, right? Where it was once seamless and in sync and sort of very much aligned, that's what defines indigenous communities. It's actually creating a rupture. It's decoupling people from what gives them their identity, their strength. So I think that that's really interesting. And that's something I'll come to a bit later. So that's the second overarching theme. The third one, this is the final one. And then I think this is the most interesting, but you might disagree with me. The third one is all about metabolism and metabolics, right? These processes of reproduction, these processes of cyclicity, of things going round and round in circles and leading to certain outcomes. I came to this most obviously from Brian's paper. That gave me the inspiration, right? Because halal industry, you know, it's food, right? It's food industry. You eat it, you metabolize it, you know, it goes into the body, right? But actually, when you think about that, it comes in, it weaves in these ideas of purity and taintedness, right? What is halal food? What is pure food? What is correct food? And how might actually the certification of halal be diminished slightly if it's a Chinese halal provider as opposed to a Middle Eastern halal provider? So as Brian mentions in his paper, this is because of state-religion relations in China. So the implication here is that the halal food industry, thank you, is always and already tainted. It's somehow less pure, right? The metabolics of Chinese halal food is somehow less halal than maybe other sources. So that metabolism there is very real, very real. The second one in Xiaokun's paper, this is about the metabolics of identity in relation to capital, in relation to the markets. I won't say too much about that. And then in terms of Alvin's paper, this is the metabolics of breaking, of this process of breaking the indigenous communities from their land, from the natural world through infrastructure. So actually what these infrastructure projects are doing are they're breaking the metabolic cycle. They're creating this division between people in their land. And then that raises the question of, well, what is filling in the space that is created by that division? Is it alternative cosmologies? Is it new cosmologies? Is it more generally processes of modernization, of secularization, whatever it may be? But what is the break in the metabolic cycle leading to in the Philippines? My time is up, but I'll just end by posing my three questions to each of the authors. This shouldn't take too long. So my questions to Brian and Xiaokun are quite straightforward. My question to Alvin is a bit more long-winded, and this is simply because infrastructure is something that I work on and that David and I are working on for the special issue in Modern Asian Studies. That's one of the outputs of this project. So let me start with Brian. And something that I didn't hear or read about in your paper and in your presentation is very simply the demand side of the equation, right? We don't hear anything about the consumer. We don't hear anything about what is the demand for China-produced halal food. And I assume if we start to talk about that from the demand perspective, we would see this interesting trade-off between pricing mechanisms, but then this idea of purity and taintedness and fidelity to the halal regulation. So that's to Brian. The second one to Xiaokun is even more straightforward. It's just simply, how do Chinese migrants reconcile these conflicts that you identify? I mean, you talk about in terms of allegiance, but also in terms of belonging. How is the idea of Chineseness in Malaysia changing in response to these dynamics? How is the idea of Muslimness changing in response? Finally, Alvin, I want to, this is just my own interest in infrastructure and you know, the dams that you're studying. So the question is infrastructure a reductionist heuristic? So the question here is, what actually does infrastructure mean? Okay. I say this in response to conversations with David over the past sort of 12 months or so, where we were putting this together, this special issue, and the whole framing of that is this idea of the infrastructural commons, right? And what does that mean? I still don't know what that means. I don't know if you figured it out, but I certainly haven't. But we came to this reductionist logic that actually everything is infrastructure, if you want to, right? It's just a way of looking at the world. So of course you see material infrastructure, dams and stuff, that's easy to point at and say infrastructure. But actually you can extract that and you can go back to the idea that everything is infrastructural. The body is an infrastructure of metabolism, of metabolics. The environment, according to Lauren Ballant, is an infrastructure of infrastructure, right? Which So where do you draw the lines of what infrastructure is, what infrastructure isn't? So two specific questions in response to that framing. So the first is, to what extent and how is Chinese infrastructure exceptional? Right? How is it different from other projects before that, from other infrastructural formations? That's the first one. The second one is, how might your analysis change if you view, and this is something I'm just giving you, if you view infrastructure as something that's multi-layered or something that's sedimented, rather than something that is singular, unitary, and exceptional. So if we think about infrastructure, not just as the Chinese dams, but actually a much more all-encompassing logic, how might that lead to new sort of analytical pathways and openings? Thank you very much for listening to me. I look forward to the discussion with the panelists.
So now you answer Olen's question, and then we'll open up our discussion to audiences. Okay. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Woods, for your comments. Regarding the demand side, my answer is also simple. I forgot, sorry. So I forgot to include it in my paper, but to provide an overview about the global demand for halal certified products, it's now $8 trillion industry, and it's increasing and exponentially increasing, because there's this prediction forecast from the Pew Research Center that by the year 2060, Muslim population will dominate all religious populations around the world. And China has been looking to it as an opportunity since the early 2000s, but because of problems on halal certification and internal problems, China, similar to my country, is still catching up in order to penetrate or to get a slice of the pie in the global halal trade.
Okay, so thank you for your comments. And I have two things to respond. The first one is, yes, I do understand that it is actually more about maybe identity and belonging rather than to the political concept of allegiance. But my point is that I'm not an anthropologist or an ethnographer. Yeah, I do history of the political thoughts and analogies of Salafis. So my focus is more on how they put everything in the frame of a classical Islamic political ideology, right? And how they apply it to interpret their own living conditions in the real lives and pertaining to the real politics. So yeah, that's a problem of my perspective. So and the second question is how the perception of Chineseness or Muslimness is changing as a response to the presence of these Chinese Muslim migrants in Malaysia. The answer is quite simple. It's not changing. I mean, the situation, the current situation for the Chinese Muslims in Malaysia, both the local Chinese converts for the migrants from mainland China, is caused by this whole political system, and the design of the country in first hand is to separate the Malays and also all the recognized Muslim ethnics and the others. Right, and by the others, I mean simply the Chinese. So if you're Chinese, then according to the system, to the design of the system, you cannot be Muslim, right? And being Muslim or being Malay in Malaysia, also means a lot of like privileges when you do business and when you purchase estates and properties. And if that does not change, I don't think the cultural sphere is gonna change in any significant extent. But interestingly though, I think the Malay society has begun to see that there are actually Chinese Muslims. For example, I saw this very interesting video clip on TikTok the other day, that there is a Chinese girl in her late 20s who has been living in Malaysia since like 10 years ago and speaks fluent Bahasa Melayu. And at first, the Malay people didn't realize that she's actually Chinese because she's Muslim. She wears her scarf, and they would just assume that she's Malay. And then she told people that, okay, I'm Chinese. Both my parents live in China, and I'm an immigrant. And they were shocked at first. And you can see that in the comments, right? But then I also see comments saying that, okay, you're so ignorant. There are many Chinese Muslims living in their country. You should open your eyes, right? So such voices have emerged. And yeah, so, well, let's see. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry. I need some water. Oh, it's okay. I have a lot of things to say, so probably not. Well, my first response is, I mean it with endearment. That was such a geography, metabolism, authenticity, and multiscalar. I think those are like three like concepts, right? So two responses. Number one, I appreciate it as a more or less like mainstream comparativist scholar. I don't get these comments in most of my conferences, right? So thank you for your comments. I really appreciate it. So two questions: what makes Chinese projects different? Number two is, if we view infrastructure not as a unit, but rather as a multiplicity, multiscalar process, what does it look like? So the first question is really difficult to answer. This is like a big research project. In fact, I'm gonna plug it. I have a book at Columbia University Press that partly deals with this question. It's gonna come out maybe in a year. I don't know. It's already been accepted, but I don't know how long it takes. But this is a big question that I feel like it's really hard to answer, right? There's people have been grappling at this for the longest time. From my own research, what makes Chinese projects different is basically, what makes it different are two things. Number one, the easiness of financing, giving the opportunities to host country elites and the Chinese firms and elites to make decisions about projects, not opening it up to other things such as like capital inflows and capital markets, which are obviously much more I would say it involves more actors, it involves more processes. I think that's what makes it different. This state-to-state, sovereignty decision-making, which Courtney Fong talks about in her work on responsibility to protect. I think that comes out when we think about Chinese projects. I think what makes it different would be, the second thing that makes it different would be, it's an outcome of overcapacity from the PRC. So the technologies, the specifics, and the aspects of it are different from other places. Now, it's an unsatisfactory answer, yet that's what I'm going to come to with your first question. I think the second question is, an economist would say infrastructure is either physical infrastructure or economic infrastructure, right? So I do take this singular definition for the paper, but if I were to view infrastructure in a geographer sense, which is multiscalar, I would look at it as like multiple influences, building the Kaliwa and the Chico River pump, the Filipino influence, the Tagalog influence, the Duterte influence, Duterte's like elites influence, different forms of Chinese actors influencing the projects as well. And I'm going to look at what comes out afterwards. Now, that's not going to work in a political science journal, but it's definitely going to work in a geography one. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I have not question, but I need your comment. First, for our brother from Philippines. Okay. No, in Islam, we always discuss about halal relate with two concepts, barakah and nafakah. This instead of talking about the commercialization of the concept of halal, is it? So, barakah means blessed. Nafakah is the way how you get it. This is how the halal constructs from a very theological ways of thinking. And now, this become more focused on halal as industry products. You know, that I need your comment on this one. Why? Because there is halal constructed in a very local area. When I was in Thailand, I asked, "Me ahan Muslim kap? You have a Muslim?" Yes. We maybe mu no pig a pork. Maybe ma no dog and no drinks, beer. So except of this treating halal, you know what I mean? This is how the concept. When I'm in the hotel, this is halal because it's chicken. But this is for halal from theological perspective, it is not, because the process not through halal. You know what I mean? This is, I need your comment about this. This very confused now for me. For example, now because we more focus on halal as industry, on capitalization of this concept, and not on the process how this. Now look, this is like the concept from theological perspective. This, I need your comment on this one. The second for our friend from Utrecht. Yes, I did my ethnography in Malaysia for 2 years. I agree with you, but I need your comment. Did you meet some Tabligis, Chinese Tabligis movement or family during your research in Malaysia? Thank you.
Pardon my voice. Gayatri Spivak said, can Salvatore speak? So I can speak today. I'm going to exercise my agency. This is a question and comes for Alvin. You talked about agency, but you didn't go into a detail. I just wonder, how is agency negotiated among different stakeholders? Because the two, the government and also the local indigenous people, and even within the indigenous people, there could be like different group, subgroups, and they have different interests. So I'm a little curious, how is this process? How does this process happen? And during your interview, are the local people satisfied with the outcome? Do they feel their agency is there, or they feel like, okay, I'm not happy with it because my agency is not there?
Thank you. My first question goes to Brian. I would like to understand from your comments how the whole halal industry links with the aspect of financing, especially Sharia financing or Sharia banking. Do they have any relationship, or you can do halal business while your banking system is any other kind of banking system? My second question goes to Alvin. What is the dividing line between physical infrastructure and economic infrastructure? Can physical infrastructure change into economic infrastructure and the other way around? Thank you.
Thanks. These are all extremely richly researched and incredibly informative papers. And I just have a few kind of information, kind of clarifications that I wanted to ask about, actually about each of the papers. So for Doce, one thing that just kind of, I still can't get my head around it. The Chinese government refused to legislate a religious law on halal on the grounds that this is a secular country, so we will not legislate on religious matters. But China is like constantly legislating and regulating everything, even reincarnations of Buddhist lamas. So since when is it said in China that we won't touch something because we're a secular state? I just find this is just so counterintuitive to the way the Chinese system operates. Why don't they do, 为了整顿混乱的 halal 的市场，我们就是要标准化、规范化什么什么。So why aren't they doing this? I don't you say it's because there's this Islamophobia or something. It still doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand. Please explain a little bit more. And why can't the China Islamic Association impose itself as the national standard? Because it already has the authority, or supposedly. You seem to mention that it also has a halal standard, but there are all these other actors, and the Islamic Association of China seems to be. So what happened with the Islamic Association of China? So right. Then the Salafis, one thing I didn't understand there is in other countries, they are now willing for this bayah, they're willing to pledge allegiance to a sovereign who is not Muslim or not respecting the precepts, not considered to be a proper Muslim or even not a Muslim in other countries. But in China, they won't do that, even though they are compelled to Aiguo Aijiao. And so they're put in a situation where actually they could be given a theological justification of that, because anyway, you have to do it as a Salafi Muslim. So then why are they not doing it in China, but other Salafis in other countries are willing to do it for non-Muslim or non-Muslim governments or Muslim governments that are clearly in many different ways violating precepts of Islam? So that was my question. And finally, for Alvin, you talked about the alliances with Catholics described at the end of the paper. So can you say a little bit more about the other groups that were involved in, so were these Catholics also opposed to the dam? Like what were the other non-Indigenous groups that kind of became part of a coalition, and what were their views on this? Thank you.
How about we let our speakers answer those questions first, as the next round of questions, okay? So, and Brian first.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for those comments and questions. Before I answer those questions, I would like to acknowledge my positionality in this research. That I would like to clarify that number one, I'm not a Muslim, and my exposure to Islam and my interest towards halal is rooted from my involvement in some research on the peace process in Mindanao, in my country. And then, yeah. With regards to the first question from my brother in Indonesia, why is it that in some places this is considered halal, in some places this is not? In my field work, in my understanding, it is rooted on different factors. Number one is religious, that I understood based on my interviews from some ulama in Mindanao and some heads of halal certifying bodies that there's no compulsion in Islam, and within Islam there's different schools of thought existing, and the differences, they call it fiqh or madhab, yeah, sorry for my pronunciation. So in that case, there's no unified interpretation what is consisted or what is considered halal or haram. And then there's even a spectrum, mashbu, the doubtful, etc. And then in that case, that is also the reason why is there no global halal standard existing, even though you have the Codex Alimentarius, but still you have different standards coming from Malaysia, Indonesia. Now the Arab regions like UAE is imposing their own, or the Gulf Cooperation Council, they are imposing their own standards. OIC also imposes its standards, and Malaysia is not cooperative with OIC. And then, and the second one is that with regards to that standards, I would like to go on this, what Dr. Woods earlier mentioned about how religion smooths the operation of capital, smoothens the operation of capital. Actually, in the case of halal, it's a double-edged sword. At the local or national level, it facilitates the confluence or the cooperation between economic interests and religious interests. But in the global level, there's this what we call secularization of halal, that even with the standards, like for example in ASEAN, in the Codex Alimentarius, UN, or not UN, but yeah, Codex Alimentarius, halal is being reduced into a set of what are the chemicals inside this food, or what are the whether the logistics of the production from farm to plate is whether compliant or not. And unfortunately, there's no global standard because each country have their own standard, and it's rooted with the school of thought existing in that geography. And in my case, in Southeast Asia, we are following, the Muslims in my region are following Shafi'i, if I'm not mistaken. And it is actually considered as the most strict, according to the literature, the most strict in terms of halal. And in some cases, they are even accusing Indonesia of being too compliant with Shafi'i, that such compliance to the Shafi'i prescriptions is already considered as a trade barrier. And then with regard to the question about Islamic financing, same applies. It really depends on the country. Like for example, some countries, they're too strict that the capital should not be contaminated, etc. But in some cases, especially for countries with minority Muslim population, the Philippines, they even allow that that government, for example, Islamic banking in my country, there's this government-sponsored Al-Amana Islamic Bank, and then they even allow the taxes from the government, although it's not considered as religiously sanctioned, to be used as capital for this banking, which is different from the one being practiced in the Middle East. And for David's question regarding Beijing's refusal, right? Beijing's refusal to legislate a national law on halal. Actually, that's honestly, I need to dig deeper on that. And thank you for raising it. And actually, I'm quite thinking regarding the comments yesterday about the difference between religious policy and ethnic policy in China. Maybe I can find the answer by revisiting the literature on that. Thank you.
Right. Thank you all for questions. And I would first like to respond to the question raised by my friend from Indonesia. Yes, there are many Muslims in connection with the Tablighi Jamaat movement living in Malaysia right now, but they are out of my scope of focus because my project is mainly focused on the Salafis. So I did not conduct any in-depth research on them. Yeah, that's the case. And to Professor Palmer's question, it might be my fault. I might need to be more clear on this because there is a really delicate or even obvious distinction between the concept of bay'ah or the pledge of political allegiance and the concept of ta'ah or simply obedience. So yeah, if you are gonna pledge allegiance to a leader, the standard is really high. I mean, there are multiple criteria regarding the political nature, the belief, and I mean everything you can think about how a person can be perfect about a leader. So you can pledge your allegiance to him. And of course, in practice, in the classical times, such standards are sometimes given up because the caliphate wasn't at all times in real power across the Muslim world. So, but anyway, at least symbolically, the standards need to be met if you want to pledge allegiance to them. And if you look at the contemporary practice of bay'ah in the Muslim world, you can see that. But of course, we have the Saudi king, who is obviously a Muslim, and there are also some Jordanian Salafis who argue that they should pledge their allegiance to the Jordanian king, who is also Muslim and also a descendant of the Prophet. So those are really very high standards, and they don't pledge their allegiance to the non-believers. That's right. But they offer their obedience to them. So yeah, I hope that solved the question. And maybe I want to say something about the question raised to Brian about the Beijing's decision not to regulate the halal food industry in any sense. The thing is that I witnessed the whole procedure where Beijing first they raised this suggestion that maybe we should issue a law that regulates the halal food production industry, and then such a suggestion ran into serious populist rejections. That's right. Chinese people, the Han Chinese people, the non-Muslim people, they just don't want the government to do anything about the halal food production industry, because that in their perspective, that makes the country well, I don't know. They just think that a secular government should not interfere with Islamic things. So yeah, so the final decision of giving up such a regulation may be a response to the populist view. So yeah.
Okay, so just three questions. The most straightforward first. So economic versus like physical infrastructure. Typically in the economics literature, physical infrastructure is public, it's large scale, it's intended to generate public goods, public services to a greater population. So thinking about like highways, railroads, bridges, etc. Now, this definition might be like, sort of contentious. I get it, but this is what people use at least. And economic infrastructure, typically not all the time private, and it's used to generate like economic growth, let's say real estate, for instance, buildings, malls for commerce, etc. This definition is not perfect, but this is what people use in any sort of quantitative regression between the two. Of course, they're convertible, but that's unimportant to my paper. But if you do want to like, explore it more, there's a bigger literature there. That's it. Great questions about like agency and sort of like the beliefs. On the agency part, yeah, this is really interesting. I was sort of thinking about ways of how to like expand the empirics of the papers, and I think you gave me like a good way to talk about it, which is times that I've actually observed when they've made democratic decision making. It's sort of a reproduction of how they sort of like do their decision making in other parts of their lives. Let's say thinking about how to distribute food, thinking about how to contribute to sort of like, let's say, livelihood. It's sort of like the same process. You have the elders in specific circumstances, the religious leaders, etc. You have people from different households coming in, and they make their agency known in those particular circumstances. Now, I would say the way the paper is framed, I do talk about agency in sort of the groups per se, but I think what you're referring to would be agencies within subgroups within the group. So I think that's super interesting. When I do talk to people about it, by and large satisfied, but obviously there are issues when it comes to divisions about gender, generation differences as well matters a lot, especially to groups, etc. Yeah, so I appreciate the comment. That's something that's going to come out in a revised version of this paper. Yeah, etc. Now, David, this is actually something that I find it to be interesting in sort of both contexts. There was greater support for. Now, generally speaking, anti-Duterte opposition movements sort of came together to sort of join indigenous groups to mobilize against Chinese projects. So you have opposition politicians, left-wing groups, you have members of the Catholic Church, and I think what unified them together was this shared vision of a society that is democratic, that is progressive, that is open to everybody, including indigenous groups. So you do have support from the Catholic Church and this coalition per se to, let's say, both movements, the Kalingas and the Remontado people. Now, there is a significant difference though. Now, the Remontado people practice certain things that I would say the majority Catholic group actually find to be unfavorable. Specifically, they move around different places and they do practice, I would say, let's say more like when they do their I'm not sure if I should say this, a bit like sensitive, but like the Remontado people, some of the 3,800 people, there's some groups, they still do like, I would say, beheading. And then that was like an issue for some Catholic some Catholic groups that they find allying with them to be like problematic. Now, I was hesitant to sort of put it in the paper because I did not want to cast sort of like any like aspersions towards this group. The Kalinga people are much more, I would say, legible to like Filipino society. A lot of them have somewhat joined the mainstream as well. Some of them are politically represented. So you do have like support there to a much greater degree. But that's the most I can say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Folks, do you have questions?
Just like David, I would like to learn more about these fascinating papers, but I was stunned to hear that the Chinese government actually listens to the public views. We need to explore that a bit more about what kind of views it listens to. Be quite selective. But to Brian's paper, no, you looked at it from a political economic perspective, if you move to a socio-cultural perspective and bring in the religious aspect to your presentation, what does it do to the Muslim identity in China with regard to the discourse on halal? Is it making any kind of impact on the people who are Muslims in China, or it's totally a business thing, has nothing to do with religion? Because religion was something that was actually missing in your paper. And I wonder why you call this a BRI period and not Xi Jinping period. It overlaps with that. So does it have to do with BRI, or does it have to do with the Chinese government's policy, irrespective of what BRI is doing or not? Xiaokun, I think when you say Tunguren, does that include Uyghurs, or you are just talking about the Hui? The reason I'm asking is because Mohammed Al-Sudairi, who was affiliated with this institute, wrote a paper, I think, on the Salafis, mostly the Uyghur Salafis, but he was pointing out how the Chinese government has a surveillance over the Chinese Salafis. So do you see that in Malaysia as well, or are the people that you are talking to are aware that the Chinese government is keeping an eye? I mean, this has happened since 9/11. So what kind of reaction with regard to belonging and the questions you are asking is predicated with the fear that somebody is listening to what they are saying? So when you publish your articles, will they be in trouble? I mean, this is a problem with Chinese ethnographic these days. For you, I think the issue with indigenous reaction to BRI projects, the scholarship on Balochistan with regard to CPEC is quite important. I think you perhaps would like to do a comparative study on what the Baluchis are doing as indigenous people in Gwadar area. But I wanted to push on the question that the discussant was pointing out, what is a Chinese project, right? Do the indigenous people react to all developmental projects, Chinese or otherwise? Or is there a specific, from that side, reaction to these projects being Chinese, right? Do they make a difference between a local Filipino project and a Chinese or other foreign projects? Thank you.
Well, thank you for all very great papers. My question is first to Brian and JIANG. If we trust in the reports of late 19th century and early 20th century Islamists reports about Muslims in China, they all complain about how heterodox they are in their religious beliefs and practices, rituals, to the point that, for example, one Turkish Islamist say there is no Islam in China. They are not living up to Islam. It's like Ibn Taymiyyah talking about Turks in the 15th century. They are Muslims only in name, not in practice. 100 years later, and I am hearing from you that the Chinese Muslims are extremely concerned about jurisprudence. Usually, and that's also the case in the Muslim world. I mean, if you read the Islamist literature about the living Islam, they all complain about how Muslims don't care about jurisprudence. But if you are concerned about halal food, this means that you are very peculiar about how it is slaughtered, how it is, So this shows you that a lot changed in the 100 years. There must be a religious revival, I should say, that term among the Chinese Muslims. So my question is it home origin or is it imported from the Middle East, especially in the Salafi case? Do we have any Saudi connection, for example, because the Saudis are. So who are the agents of this new religiosity among the Chinese? For example, halal food. Halal food is a clearly imitation of kosher from the Jews, right? Who came up with this idea? I mean, who gave you the idea that this is the right thing to do? There must be a conscious efforts on some people to make the Chinese Muslims more and more religious. And my last question to Alvin, you rightly pointed out that this Chinese project are empowering certain groups and undermining the other. That's very interesting insight. Is China aware of that? And is China willingly and consciously picking up the winners against the losers? In the Turkish case, for example, I heard that, I don't know personal experience, but the former Maoists, for example, are very instrumental in bringing the Chinese investments to Turkey. So you have to get some kind of a reference letter from a former Maoist who has. So is it a similar case in Philippines?
Yeah, just a very brief comment, if I may, for Brian. There was a very interesting book by a colleague, Rashid Aziz, her name, at University of Texas at Austin, that was published 5 years ago almost on halal food. And part of her contribution that I was most impressed with was the business aspect of it, how it has found its own momentum, that across regions, the fact that it's a huge business and there's a great deal of profit to be made has become a steamroller that along the lines, though it finds its religious justification and propagation of why a good Muslim should eat halal food, etc., facilitates that business dynamics. Have you come across that book? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for all the presentations. My question is for Alvin. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is related to the indigenous community in Philippines. I'm wondering if there is any legal means that, like if there is any legal tools, legal means, like regulation related to these indigenous communities, especially related to their land rights. Also, I'm wondering about their citizenship status and rights in Philippines. How about the discourse there and this citizenship status related to the recognition of their religion, because they are indigenous religion, are they recognized? And if not, how they are governed by the government in terms of their religious identity? And lastly, related to the human rights discourse, I'm wondering how the human rights discourse is going on in Philippines now. We know at least in international level, related to the indigenous people, there is United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and how it's going on in Philippines, especially related to the religious freedom, because they are indigenous religions. It means they explain the relation to land as something religious, right? So when their land is taken, it is a violation of human rights. It is a violation of the religious freedom. So yeah, related to this discussion. Thank you.
So I think this discussion can continue during the break. So thank you very much.